Welcome, everyone, to the Mining and Metallurgical Society of America webinar series. MMSA is an association of mineral resource professionals whose members represent all facets of the mining and metallurgical interests, both domestic and internationally. MMSA has always been a cohesive group of senior people from the mineral industry. The society is dedicated to increasing public awareness and understanding about mining and why mined materials are essential to modern society as well as human well-being. The society concerns itself with fundamental principles with problems facing the industry in such areas as legislation, economics and education, as well as environmental concerns, labor relations, and health and safety. Representation of the society from time to time testify before legislative bodies and provide advice to federal agencies. I'm Kristen Guerin-Davy, MMSA member and social media and webinar director. I will be introducing the webinar today. The title of today's webinar is Mission Impossible, Mineral Shortages and Permitting Delays Put Net Zero Out of Reach by Debra Struhsacker, Environmental Permitting and Government Relations Consultant, as well as Sarah Montalbano, Policy Fellow of the American Experiment. Questions can be entered into the chat during the presentation. The speaker will answer the questions after the presentation is completed. And I'll hand it over to Curtis.
Good afternoon, everyone, and we'd like to thank you for joining MMSA today. I chair the committee at MMSA to bring these webinars to you, and we are very fortunate to have Debra Struhsacker and Sarah Montalbano with us today to explain to us the findings of their study, which was just introduced by Kristen. So we look forward to listening to Debbie and Sarah, and I'll hand it over to them right now.
Just launch this off and then hand it over to Sarah. I'm going to take a minute to introduce myself a little bit more and the Women's Mining Coalition, which is one of the co-sponsors of this webinar. For those of you that I haven't had the pleasure of meeting, I am a geologist by training, but for the last several decades of my career, I have specialized in environmental permitting and regulatory issues affecting mining and public lands. And I and two other women started the Women's Mining Coalition back in 1993, and we are still going strong as one of the country's most effective advocacy groups. Our kind of keynote event every year is an annual Washington, D.C. fly-in where we gather women from all over the mining industry who work in all facets of it across the country, and we convene in Washington, D.C. to meet with legislators about the importance of mining. We're often in kind of a defensive mode, trying to persuade them not to enact policies that would be harmful to mining, but whenever we can support pro-mining policies, we of course do that. And I know as Women's Mining Coalition is really pleased to be able to co-host this webinar today with MMSA. I'm also an MMSA member. And with that, I'll hand it off to Sarah to introduce herself and American Experiment.
Thank you, Debbie. I'm Sarah Montalbano. I'm an Energy Policy Fellow at Center of the American Experiment. And just a quick bit about our organization. We're a 501c3 nonprofit think tank based in Minnesota. And we're dedicated to educating and informing policymakers on a wide variety of issues. And energy and environment is my specialty. So it has been an absolute pleasure to work with Debbie on this report. It's full of fantastic information, and it was really hard to distill down to the number of slides that we have here. But without further delay, I'm going to hop into it. So just to see where we're going with this, the energy transition policies that the US and other nations are looking at is creating an enormous demand for minerals. And that is probably not news, but it is important to understand that minerals are underpinning not only this renewable effort, but also conventional energy, national defense, and the modern economy. It would not be possible for me to address you all without the computers and cameras and microphones and all of the minerals associated with that. And policymakers are implementing these net zero emissions by 2050 standards that are spurring new mineral demand. And so we have these business as usual needs that must still be met. And we're also seeing just over the last year or so, artificial intelligence, data centers, electrification are all on the collision course with renewable energy demands. at this time. And public policies, I think, are a really important point to this, a really important impedance. They're preventing domestic mining projects that would be needed to meet these net zero goals. And consequently, the US is dangerously reliant on foreign countries. And all of that comes at a cost, serious environmental and human rights costs. And so I want to get clear on a couple of definitions that we have for net zero by 2050. When we talk about this, we're talking about the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement, and that was at the UN's Conference of Parties. The 21st of that, I think you would know that the 29th of that is going on right now in Azerbaijan. And so there were 190 signatory nations back in 2015, including the US. We've been in that agreement, all except for a brief withdrawal in 2020. And that agreement aims to limit global temperature increase to below 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels by 2100. NZE, when we use that abbreviation, is the International Energy Agency's scenario. And it assumes that we generally do meet these Paris Agreement goals, that global CO2 emissions are net zero by 2050. Global temperature rise is restricted to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels by 2100. And a lot of countries have taken steps to meeting those goals with similar or more ambitious timelines. The United Kingdom and Germany come to mind. And states like Minnesota are enacting laws like this to enforce entirely carbon-free electricity by 2040. Another thing that the IEA discusses, their announced pledges scenario, it just takes into account all of the climate commitments made by governments so far will be met in full and on time. And that would not totally meet this net zero emissions scenario. It would, with a 50% probability, suggest that temperature rise is restricted to 1.7 degrees Celsius.
And Sarah, let me jump in just a minute here
please.
And say that President-elect Trump has signaled that he is going to once again withdraw the US from the Paris Climate Agreement.
Yes, that has been apparently a large topic of discussion at this year's climate meeting. So what do our business as usual mineral demands look like? I think it's really important, and we underscored it first in the paper, that Americans and people across the world are reliant on minerals and metals and fuels to hold this standard of living that we do. And it's an enormous number, 3 million pounds in their lifetime. And that's about 40,000 pounds per American per year. Just a couple of those minerals that are really useful in modern electronics, batteries, renewable energy technologies, national defense. On the screen there, copper, cobalt, nickel, rare earth. We examine those and profile them in a little depth in the paper. And copper, I think this is Debbie's favorite mineral, perhaps. It's the linchpin of electrification. So the average single-family home for plumbing, for electrification, is using 439 pounds of copper. And this is a fantastic paper that we quote in length in the paper. It's just meet business as usual needs. So not thinking about electric vehicles or renewables for everyone. We will need 115% more copper. It must be mined in the next 30 years than has been mined in human history up through 2018. So that is a huge need that we're looking at here. And BHP is forecasting a 70% surge in copper demand by 2050. And this figure we reproduce in our paper, this just breaks down a little further. What are these 3 million pounds of minerals will any American need over their lifetime? And so we come to the conclusion, and I think it's very well supported, that the mineral demands for alternative energy and AI are outpacing mineral supplies. Manufacturing of EVs, solar panels, wind turbines, battery storage, and more transmission lines, that will consume large amounts of lithium, copper, nickel, cobalt, graphite, and rare earths, at the very least. And a key driver of that is battery electric vehicles. Its widespread adoption of these technologies will drive soaring mineral demand. Copper and manganese are hugely more required for EVs than internal combustion engines, and a wide array of minerals are only really needed in electric vehicles as well. And so we have copper shortfalls where demand will exceed supply, and that's imminent. That's coming up shortly after 2025, and cobalt 2030, as well as nickel in 2025. And I think it's important to note as well that technological advancements and recycling will help, but they can't eliminate the 2050 shortfall entirely. And so this is a figure from our paper. I really think this hammers home because we see a lot of zeros in lithium, nickel, cobalt, graphite, rare earths, and that's about it. That's all that only electric vehicles need. That's not what internal combustion engines need. And the weight of these batteries in the EVs is really just astounding. We have 66 kilograms of graphite in an average electric vehicle battery. And this comes back to our copper. There are similar figures for cobalt and nickel in the paper, but we wanted to highlight copper in particular in its electrification role. The announced pledges scenario is on the left of this figure, and net zero emissions scenarios as well. And we can see the demand for that is going to spike. We have copper being fueled a lot by electric grids, but also construction and other demands on that. And we can see in the right half of the figure as well that that shortfall is already going to be occurring by 2025. The announced pledges scenario line is slightly lower than the net zero emissions line, but in any case, we are falling quite short. Anything to add to this one, Debbie?
No, that's good.
All right, perfect. And then I want to hand it to you to discuss this report you alerted us to.
Okay, well, great. BHP published a copper forecast report in September of this year, and I recommend the report highly to everybody. And I've got a link. We've got the reference to it in a subsequent slide. But BHP is projecting a 70% surge in copper demand by 2050, which is an increase of 22.1 metric tons from 2021 levels. And they equate that to the equivalent output of more than 16 Escondida mines running at full capacity. Escondida is a ginormous open pit copper mine in Chile, and it's the largest copper mine in the world. And it's a joint venture between BHP and Rio Tinto and a Japanese company. BHP is looking at what they describe as a simultaneous surge in copper demand that's going to occur worldwide in the next 25 years as everybody is looking towards electrification, decarbonization, and digitization. And it's kind of we're on a collision course. As we have said, copper is critical for electric vehicles, but it's also needed for renewable energy systems, AI data centers, and business as usual construction, capital goods, and consumer products. And again, I want to underscore something that Sarah said earlier. This was a finding in our report that I didn't previously understand, but the demand for minerals, particularly copper, that is created by battery electric vehicles is really a huge component of the mineral demand for net zero. And it's not solely the minerals used per se in the electric vehicle. You have to also add to that the minerals, particularly the copper, that's needed to build the recharging network worldwide. So it's a huge demand. And so that's why transportation and power infrastructure are the largest drivers of the copper demand. And just in general, renewable energy systems use a lot more copper than traditional energy grids. And the BHP report has some really good data on it for where are we currently getting our copper supplies, with the inference that where we're getting them now is likely where we'll be able to get them in the future. But you can see that North America is, a fairly minor supplier compared to Latin America, which is the largest supplier, Africa being a pretty significant supplier, as well as the Asian Pacific region. Here's an infographic from Mining Visuals that has synthesized the data that's presented in that BHP report. I think it's really an interesting graphic because, again, it shows that the largest increase, over 223%, is attributable to the transportation sector. So here again, you've got the battery electric vehicles and the charging stations. Another very significant component, 69%, is to power and infrastructure. So this is a huge increase in demand. As we said a minute ago, that's 16 Escondida mines. And, putting on my hat as a geologist, I think it's worth asking ourselves, does the world contain 16 more copper mines the size of Escondida? I don't know the answer to that. And a corollary question is, if in fact the world contains that much copper, can we find it fast enough to have it available when we need it? I think those are two pretty compelling questions, and I'm not sure anybody has the answer to that.
And I think I will take it from at least this slide, just to underscore again that this AI power demand, AI is not just what we are going to be building out. So obviously, AI data centers are exacerbating copper demand already because copper is very useful in electronics. It's used in the power cables and bus bars, all of these electrical components to the actual data centers themselves. But just like the problems with electric vehicles on the grid is not just that they have mineral demand for their batteries, but we also need to be building out transmission infrastructure as well. And they are being constructed rapidly. We're seeing in the news every day, it seems like some tech giant has made a deal to acquire power from whatever utility they're in. And I think it's worth underscoring here that data centers could consume up to 9% of US electricity generation by 2030. Another estimate of this is that electricity demand is going to grow from 200 terawatt hours in 2022 to 260 terawatt hours in 2026, and that's coming from the IEA. And that's an increase from 4% to 6% of total electricity demand. So this is one of my pet topics. I really do find it interesting. Even if the hype isn't real, we will still be making some really significant infrastructure investments, assuming that it is.
And I'll just jump in and say that I think there's another interesting question to ask ourselves. Assuming the copper shortage is real and fairly dire, then the world needs to make a decision about the best ways to allocate the copper that we have. And is it better to use copper in battery electric vehicles, or is it better to use copper to develop the new technology of artificial intelligence and data centers and all of the promise that they hold? I mean, you could ask yourself, well, power hungry AI centers might be part of the key to finding the solutions to some of these mineral shortages and how we reach net zero. So does it make more sense to invest the copper there or battery electric vehicles? And I just think those are the kinds of questions that we need to ask ourselves in the future, soon, right away, actually, to have a more coherent approach to what we're going to do to attempt to achieve the net zero goals.
I couldn't have said it better. And I think I will hand it to you, Debbie.
Okay. This chart, which is probably a little hard for you to read here, but it's shown nicely in the report, is actually from a Government Accountability Office report that was published earlier this year that has synthesized the USGS data on critical minerals where we import critical minerals from, the amount that we import, and how those critical minerals are used in key sectors in our society, starting with aerospace, defense, energy, telecommunications, and non-aerospace transportation. And it's the reason I am so enamored of this chart is it's such a good synthesis of information that shows how dependent we are on critical minerals for all of these extremely important sectors, including energy and defense, and that we have very significant reliance on foreign countries for many, many of these minerals. In fact, this chart shows the U.S. is 100% import reliant for 10 critical minerals and more than 50% import reliant for 31 of them. You'll see that China features very prominently here on many of the mineral imports. We have a dependency in China ranging from 34% import reliance for graphite and 74% for rare earth elements. All of this mineral import reliance creates serious supply chain vulnerabilities that threaten our national security, our energy independence, and other essential sectors. And you're probably also noticing that Canada is one of the other chief suppliers of minerals. And the U.S. has policies like the mineral security policy to try to focus on importing minerals that we need from friendly nations like Canada. But I question the wisdom of that because Canada's got its own need for minerals and its own net zero goals and aspirations. So is it really appropriate and risk-free for us to simply rely on Canada, Mexico, and Australia and other friendly nations for the minerals that we need? And Sarah, we can go on to the next slide. Oh, let's go. There we go. So we talked about this a little bit, but just to put a little more meat on the bones, this was a statistic that really alarmed me. There's a fairly recent Department of Defense study that estimates that in an armed conflict, a conventional armed conflict, so not a nuclear conflict, but a conventional armed conflict with China, that the U.S. would face a shortfall of 69 minerals, 20 of which we primarily import from China. I find that very disturbing. And China has, in the last year and a half, demonstrated that it is quite willing to impose significant export restrictions on key minerals to try to influence geopolitics. So in 2023, they restricted exports of gallium and germanium, which are essential components of high-tech semiconductor chips, and have a stranglehold on those minerals, having decreased their exports from 8.63 metric tons of germanium prior to the ban to 1 kilogram in August 2023. And for the case of gallium, there's really virtually no gallium now coming from China. Similarly, in 2024, China announced it was restricting exports of antimony. Antimony is a key and essential mineral for military applications, for manufacturing munitions. And we rely on China for 83% of our antimony for imports, 63% of which comes from China. We've seen antimony prices surge since China imposed that ban. And as many of you probably know, we're on the brink, hopefully, of having a domestic antimony producer in Idaho with Perpetua Resources' Stibnite mine. I mean, it's going to take a couple years for it to go into production, but it's nearing the end of the permitting process. Okay, Sarah, I think we're ready to move on. I want to just quickly alert you to the fact that it's not just about mining these minerals that we need to be concerned about. because China dominates the entire supply chain, both the downstream and midstream sectors of, in this case, we're looking at electric vehicle batteries. So the red here is the symbol for China. And you can see that China mines most of the world's graphite, but it doesn't mine that much of some of the other key battery minerals, lithium, nickel, cobalt. But go to the next steps. Material processing. China is got an enormous footprint on mineral processing of these minerals. And then farther down the supply chain in manufacturing the cathodes and anodes that go into the batteries, manufacturing them into battery cells, and then finally producing actual EVs. The US is got the Kelly green symbol on this chart, and you'll see that the only two sectors in which that shows up is we do produce some battery cells. A lot of that's here in Nevada at the Panasonic Gigafactory. And then, of course, we make EVs too. Okay, next slide, please, Sarah. So I'm going to segue now into the policy analysis that's in our report, because a key finding of our report is that there are recent administrative rules and policies that reduce mining on public lands that are absolutely contrary to the country's goals in terms of achieving net zero by 2050. And I'm going to talk about each of these in a little bit of detail, but they are, in summary, the BLM's Public Lands Rule, which was issued in June of this year, BLM's Western Solar Plan, and that final EIS was issued in August of this year. Hot off the press is BLM's Greater Sage Grouse Draft Resource Management Plan and Environmental Impact Statement. Final EIS was issued in November, just last Friday, a week from today. We have the Council on Environmental Qualities, or CEQ's final NEPA rule, which was issued in July of 2024. And then we've got just a kind of a progression of mine permit delays, denials, lease revocations, and land withdrawals that we've been experiencing from 2020 until today. All of these policies increase our reliance on foreign minerals and reduce our energy security. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Public Lands Rule. This is a rule that is trying to throttle back the use of public lands for a variety of multiple use purposes. And this rule is in violation of the Federal Land Policy and Management Act's multiple use mandate. This rule emphasizes designating lands as critical areas of critical environmental concern where uses are severely restricted. A very concerning aspect of this rule is it develops this new and novel kind of lease where third parties can obtain mitigation and restoration leases that are designed for non-use of those lands, that will functionally put the lands under lease off limits to mining and other multiple uses. It creates de facto requirements for compensatory mitigation to offset project impacts, which compensatory mitigation is not authorized under FLPMA. So there's a lot of activity to push back on this rule. The House passed the Western Economic Security Today Act that is trying to, well, that if it were to pass the Senate, would prohibit the BLM from implementing this rule. And then a number of states, including Alaska, Montana, North Dakota, Utah, and Wyoming, numerous other multiple use plaintiffs have filed various lawsuits alleging that this rule is unlawful. And there are two mining advocacy groups involved in these lawsuits, AEMA and the National Mining Association. So again, this rule is really kind of flagrantly ignores FLPMA's multiple use mandate. It elevates conservation to a use, so non-use to a use, and it changes FLPMA into a non-use or limited use policy. Moving on to the Western Solar Plan, this plan makes solar energy a preferred land use on 31 million acres of BLM administered lands in 11 Western states. So again, ignoring FLTMA's multiple use mandate. It establishes a strong preference for solar energy projects over other multiple use. And, solar panels pretty well sterilize the land. You can't do much on a utility scale solar project. So it's pitting solar energy against mineral exploration and mining, which the EIS describes as pretty much categorically incompatible and mutually exclusive uses of the land for obvious reasons. There have been numerous protests filed to administratively challenge this plan. I know that 15 of Nevada's 17 counties filed protests. Nevada Governor Joe Lombardo's consistency review letter tells BLM that they should have chosen the no action alternative rather than to put these 31 million acres of land as the preferred use for solar. Congress has also been involved and has requested BLM to withdraw this plan. So can we go to the next slide, which shows just where these lands that are have solar preference use are located. And Nevada is bearing the brunt of it, with almost 12 million acres being designated as preferred sites for solar energy development. Most of that land is in southern Nevada, but you can see other western states are pretty seriously affected too, with Wyoming, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico shouldering a pretty big brunt as well. Again, they all add up to over 31 million acres across these states. Moving on then to the sage-grouse plan, which was published just last Friday. The sage-grouse plan designates 69 million acres of sage-grouse habitat in 10 western states. It amends 77 resource plans. And this slide needs to, I guess the update didn't get in here, Sarah, but the final EIS designates about 34.5 million acres of priority habitat management areas on which solar, wind, and transmission lines are pretty much flat out categorically prohibited.
Do you want me to pull up the updated slides? I can stop sharing for a second and do that.
Well, I don't. That's okay. I can just talk to. We can make sure that those get in the deck.
Yeah, we can send that out.
Yeah. Because there is an updated version here. So here we have this. I would call it the Nevada paradox, where BLM has designated 30 or 12 million acres in Nevada as great places for solar energy development in southern Nevada. And in northern and central Nevada, which is where sage-grouse habitat occurs, there's about 10 million acres where wind and solar and transmission lines are prohibited. So it's a looking at that together, it's a very incoherent policy. I will add that in terms of minerals, the final EIS is not that bad on minerals in that it does not include the sagebrush focal area withdrawals that the 2015 plan had included, which was, excuse me, had proposed to withdraw almost 11 million acres from operation of the mining law. But mining is going to still be very severely restricted on those 34.5 million acres of priority habitat management areas. Okay, next slide. The CEQ's final rule on NEPA is equally problematic. NEPA affects absolutely all projects that require a federal permit. It's not just something that affects mining. It certainly affects transmission lines and wind and solar and other infrastructure projects. This new rule is basically trying to transform the National Environmental Policy Act into the National Environmental Protection Act. And that's not something that executive branch agency like the Council on Environmental Quality can do. Only Congress could make that change to NEPA. And NEPA is, as probably many of you know, it's a procedural and disclosure law. It requires federal agencies to disclose what the environmental impacts are of a proposed project, but it's not the source of environmental protection. It's other laws like the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act that actually contain the environmental protection standards that keep our environment clean and healthy. So these new NEPA rules actually have a requirement in them for federal agencies to select an environmentally preferred alternative, which often will conflict with the agency's permitting programs to, say, authorize an NPDES effluent disposal permit or a mining permit that is going to disturb, because mining does, lands. So it's a bit of a train wreck here. The new NEPA regulations also will invite a lot more litigation because they allow new issues to be raised at any point in the process. And I think as a hallmark of how bad this rule is, 20 states are challenging this NEPA rule, saying that the agency, CEQ, does not have the authority to make this kind of change to NEPA. Okay, next slide. There's one other sort of ray of hope for NEPA that has just happened in the last 6 weeks. Congress passed a bill called the Building Chips in America Act in late September, and President Biden quietly signed this bill into law in early October. The bill basically recognizes that there's such an urgency to manufacture domestic semiconductor chips that it exempts certain semiconductor projects from NEPA. I interpret this to mean that in this case, Congress and the president have admitted that NEPA is so broken that they just can't fix it fast enough to respond to this urgent need to reduce US reliance on Chinese semiconductor chips. So I'm suggesting that Congress should enact similar exemptions to eliminate NEPA's chokehold on the economy, especially for projects needed for the energy transition, like critical minerals, transmission lines, and alt energy. And I think that's our last substantive slide. And I think now it's time to open it up to you, our audience, for questions. And we certainly appreciate your attendance and your patience as we went through this proposal or this presentation. And Sarah and I will do our best to answer any questions that you have.
Looks like we have a few questions already in the chat here. So first from Mark, are we overstating demand for new copper mines by 2025 by ignoring recycling of copper? EV now will or should be recycled.
I'll take an initial stab at that. There are lots of reports in the IEA's report and other reports, including that BHP report, do talk about recycling. I think, recycling is going to be more and more important as time evolves, but it's not the solution right now. I mean, if you, certainly copper has been successfully recycled for many, many years. But if you think about the copper that is going to be temporarily stored in battery electric vehicles, and it's just going to take a while for that copper mass to reach a critical quantity for recycling of it to make a meaningful dent in the demand. So the answer is yes, recycling is absolutely important, but we can't catch up with recycling yet.
Great. From Xavier here, I have, with the increase in power demand, would nuclear have to be considered? If so, uranium and lead demand ought to exist.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
And we have a tremendous reliance on foreign sources of uranium right now. So yes, Sarah, you might want to talk about this a little bit, but there are a couple of, Googles and the Microsofts of the world that are trying to actually redevelop some nuclear energy sites for their power to meet their power demands.
Yeah, I thought this was a good question when I saw it because, yeah, we would have more demand for nuclear materials as well. I believe Russia is a somewhat significant source of uranium, and it's notable that we did not cut off imports of uranium when Russia invaded Ukraine. Um, Another thing I would mention though is that if we're looking at the costs and material intensity of trying to achieve net zero goals, nuclear is definitely the way to go. Several policy fellows at American Experiment before my time did some calculations on this and various other reports available at our website to look at the costs of Minnesota doing this in particular. And it's not even close. So that is what I would say on that.
Great. Also from Xavier, we have, do you know if the reliance on Chinese imports of these 20 minerals is based on mining capacity, installed processing capacity, or the sum of both? Seems like we don't look at whether it is upstream or downstream sourcing shortfalls.
I think that's a good question. I suspect that the Department of Defense has probably pretty good numbers on just what part of the supply chain is the most problematic. But taken as a whole, in a way, maybe it doesn't matter that much if they dominate just even one segment of that supply chain, then you don't have the supply chain.
Great. Looks like we have an interesting comment here from Curtis. Interesting that blue states have much lower land area captured in the 31 million acre tally.
Well, I noticed that. Some of it is a reflection on how much public land is in those states. So Nevada has, an enormous public lands footprint here. So that's a portion of it. But New Mexico is at this point a blue state. It had I think it was over 4 million acres in New Mexico. So I think probably it's mostly a reflection of the amount of public land and where the sun shines.
From Thomas here, we have, how do you see the chances of the Bipartisan Energy Permitting Reform Act passing in 2025?
I think there is going to be a big focus on permitting in the next Congress, whether it's that bill, which is a good bill, or some other bill, some combination of ideas that are being considered. I'm hoping that NEPA exemption in the Building Chips Act starts to infiltrate people's thought process as well for projects that we are absolutely urgently need. But with the change in administration and the new Congress, I think we are going to see permitting reform activities. I hope they can happen fast enough to make a difference.
Yeah. Lisa says, other than the withdrawal of the US from the Paris Climate Agreement, is there any way to speculate as to the impact the Republican sweep will have?
Well, I'll take a stab at this and then ask Sarah for her thoughts. I mean, President-elect Trump has definitely said he's going to end the EV mandate. And those mandates are huge. I mean, I believe they are projecting 50% of all vehicle sales by 2030, is it? To be 50% by 2030 and something like 70% by 2032. I mean, that's just not going to happen. So I think you're going to see the EV mandates be either relaxed or completely eliminated. But Sarah, do you have some other thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I've been hearing all sorts of speculation, and a lot of it could be very within possibilities. The EV mandate, I think, is one of the biggest ones. The other one, from a grid reliability standpoint, is the EPA's Clean Power Plan 2.0. Those greenhouse gas emission standards for power plants are going to force coal plants to retrofit or retire by basically requiring that they capture 90% of their carbon emissions by like 2032 if they want to keep operating past 2039. So I think there's a slim chance that that would survive with this incoming administration, which would be fantastic for the grid. I also think we will see, just in the kind of AI landscape, we will see a resurgence of interest in nuclear. And we're definitely seeing that right now with the restarting of the 3 Mile Island reactor, as well as several other projects that have been recently announced. So I'm sure I'm missing a ton of things on my wish list. I think a large number of the policies that we looked at, as well as a bunch of specific mineral and lease withdrawals. I know Minnesota's waiting to see what the new administration would do about twin metals and NorthMet. But there are just so many specific instances that could be reversed. I'm hopeful that there will be NEPA reform as well.
Well, and I'll just add, as long as we're talking about our wish list, I mean, one of the things that I think is most alarming about the path that we are on right now is, as Sarah mentioned, this Clean Power Plan, which is caused the premature closing of many natural gas and coal-fired power plants, and the substitution of weather-dependent wind and solar energy systems for what had been 24/7 dispatchable, always available power. And it has significantly weakened the reliability of our electrical grid. And I'm very hopeful that the new Congress and the incoming Trump administration will put a stop to that and will refocus the nation's energy on ensuring that we have a reliable electrical grid.
Agreed.
From Mark, are we also considering the increased water needs that goes with mining, processing, and use of these commodities?
I think, Mark, that's a great question. I don't think anybody has really taken a sharp pencil to look at the full environmental footprint of what mining those enormous volumes of minerals would mean. So let's just take an Escondida. Let's say that we're going to find 16 more Escondidas in Latin America. I mean, think about the water demand there. Or if you were to find them, say, some of them in Indonesia, where in a much wetter climate, think about the potential for ARD at mines like that, or the need to have very carefully engineered tailings disposal facilities that are designed for such high rainfall, high precipitation climates. I just don't think people have taken a look holistically at the environmental impacts, to say nothing of the CO2 emissions involved in mining those materials. But I do think that a much broader look at the total environmental impacts of all of the mining need to be looked at so we can make an informed decision about, are we really solving a problem here, or are we potentially creating a different problem?
Thanks, Debbie. The reason I brought that up is to your earlier points about copper, we have a copper mine here, or potential copper mine here in New Mexico, that was operational in the 80s and then closed, and now they're hung up on their permitting because of water. And that's going to be a big thing for us, certainly in other states in the Southwest.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think water is a limiting factor, not just for mining, but for just about everything in the arid southwestern U.S.
And if I may ask another question related to this, are your groups working with the different water groups on this? Because I know we have a bunch of initiatives on water here in New Mexico, and I think the other Four Corner states do as well, but I have no idea if they're really talking to the mining side of things.
Well, we haven't specifically reached out to water groups. I mean, certainly, just talking about mining in general in Nevada, Nevada mining companies work really closely with water interests, both regulators and, of course, water rights owners here in Nevada. But I don't think those dots have particularly been connected. No.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. From Bruce here, we have, where do we stand in regard to proposed legislation to fix the HUD Bay issues related to using load claims for facilities ancillary to mining?
So that's a great question. There is pending before Congress now the Mining Regulatory Clarity Act. It's passed the House. It hasn't passed the Senate yet. The Senate version is different than the House version. And Bruce, I guess I would say that I am sure that AEMA and the National Mining Association and others are looking for ways to get the Senate language into a must-pass bill like the National Defense Authorization Act or some other bill to get it across the finish line this year. If that were to happen, the Rosemont problem would pretty well go away. Just very briefly, the Senate version of that bill amends Section 42, the mill site section of the mining law, to create an optional new kind of mill site that can be located on lands that are mineral in character, non-mineral in character, or lands where the mineral character is not known. And the language in that bill specifies that you could co-locate this new kind of mill site on top of a load or placer claim. There would be a $200 per mill site fee, and those fees in aggregate would go to an abandoned mine lands fund. So stay tuned. I'm sure people are looking for opportunities to get that over the finish line.
Curtis.
Good. Thank you, Debbie.
Curtis just had a note here. Immense reserves of uranium discovered and defined in Saskatchewan, Canada in the past 15 years just need capital investment to be developed on that end. Kathy says, is there any data on how many of the mining operations in countries other than China have all or partial Chinese ownership?
That's a great question. There's significant Chinese ownership of mines in Canada, for one thing, so that obtaining minerals from Canada isn't necessarily cutting China out of the picture at all. China also has significant investment in mines in Africa and Indonesia. And I suspect that there's actual, data for that, but generally speaking, China has been extraordinarily strategic in its Belt and Roads initiative to gobble up these mineral supplies and secure strongholds in the various stages along the supply chain in terms of mineral processing. So they've got their fingers in a lot of operations. I mean, Sarah, do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, that's exactly what I was thinking is I don't have the numbers offhand, but there's a growing awareness that this is a significant problem. Absolutely.
Okay, we have a few more questions here from Xavier. Is there something that can be done to raise awareness on the CHIPS NEPA exception with the incoming administration and the new Congress and Senate?
I think, starting to talk about it with key legislators and, that would be the kind of thing that the American Exploration and Mining Association, National Mining Association, other industry trade associations would start to do in their lobbying campaigns.
And there is a wide array of think tanks that are also seeing this and saying, hey, that's our in. We've been talking about permitting reform for quite a long time, and now it's finally seeing some bipartisan recognition.
This is kind of a heretical thing to say, but I think it's important to understand, or just to put NEPA in a historical context. NEPA was enacted in 1969, And in 1969, we didn't have environmental protection laws in this country. They were mainly enacted starting in the 1970s with the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and a burgeoning array of media-specific environmental protection laws that were developed in the 1970s through the 1980s and into the 1990s. So NEPA is not needed to protect the environment. It's a policy act. It's the National Environmental Policy Act. I think it's worth taking a look at NEPA to see if it's run its course. Does it still have a use? That's probably a shocking thing for some people to hear, but it has become such a barrier to everything that it has kneecapped the country's ability to advance critically important projects. And it's not just about mining here. I mean, it's about roads, pipelines, transmission lines, and all sorts of important infrastructure. Sarah, you were talking the other day about how even space launches require a NEPA analysis from the FAA, right?
Yeah, I mean, there was a really fascinating just Wall Street Journal opinion piece just a couple of weeks ago that highlighted this in the context that SpaceX has to go through an environmental impact statement every time they want to launch something. And this process is eating up millions of dollars and years of time from an enormous number of projects across the country. So as an Alaskan, I've always felt very strongly on that kind of issue, but coming to the realization that even space launches are needing this too, just kind of connected things for me.
Great. Xavier also just said, going back to upstream and downstream production controlled by China, we can relatively easier and faster build processing and refining capacity versus exploration and mining.
Well, both are pretty difficult to do in the US right now, but I think there is not only do we need to look at significantly increasing domestic production of the minerals, but we desperately need to expand greatly our domestic mineral processing capabilities.
And I would point out too that the manufacturing and processing and refining, all of these steps also will need a really strong electric grid and low affordable electricity prices as well, because we've had examples in Minnesota of the Hibbing foundry, which closed down after some recent rate increases came in, and they were spending more on electricity than any other line item on their budget, and they just could not make it work. So the electric grid will need to be very reliable and affordable in order to bring manufacturing back here.
Andrea just has a comment here. An overabundance of water, such as in the upper Midwest, also has its own problems for mining as well.
It certainly does.
Wait.
Feast or famine.
Barbara asks, have you thought about the amount of capital investment that might be needed for these mines? Money goes to the virtual world, not to bricks, mortar, and holes in the ground.
There have been some estimates, and I don't recall the statistic off the top of my head for the investment needed in mining. However, I do know it was in the trillions. It's huge. And so that's part of the challenge. I mean, you can't have the mines without the enormous investment it takes to explore for the minerals. And then if you're successful in discovering minerals, developing them into a mine. I mean, these are billion-dollar projects. Or
There's a
in many
paragraph.
cases, multi-billion-dollar projects.
Exactly. And I was recalling and trying to remember the exact figures. And I recall that the investment gap that is written down in our paper is, somewhere in the hundreds of billions of dollars. There's just not as much coming in as would be needed to find these mines and
of
develop
course,
them.
part of that is policy driven. If you have a situation like we currently have in the US, where there are so many permitting and policy barriers, then that significantly chills investment.
Yeah, Barbara had another note on that saying, and this is long-term investment, not near-term returns. A few more questions here from Xavier. Financing extra production in the US and friendly jurisdictions is limited to the market. Should the US government instrument a market incentive for investors to be compelled to jump in?
I don't know if that's an appropriate role for the government, but I will tell you that what I think is going to need to happen is I think the federal government is going to have some kind of commodity price guarantees. Because one of the other things that China is doing is, in lithium's the poster child right now, is flooding the market to depress prices to make all of these lithium projects not in China uneconomic. So I think one of the things that the government is going to have to do is to step in and guarantee to mineral producers a certain minimum price. We saw a couple of years ago, there was a cobalt mine in Idaho, the Jervois project, that they were, just this close to starting up, and China manipulated cobalt prices to make that project uneconomic to pursue.
And I think Barbara kind of hits it on the head with this comment, and I was about to jump in and say essentially the same idea, that it's less that we need more incentives for this and that we need to be leveling the playing field across wind and solar and battery storage manufacturers and things like that, because I think there is a lot of easy money and subsidies and tax credits coming out right now, and we will see also as well if the administration changes that through a repeal or reform of the Inflation Reduction Act. But that is, I think, the boon that's been seen right now. And until that stuff is leveled out, I don't know where investors will decide to go, where there's easy money or long-term investments.
Looks like from Curtis here, since SK 1300 replaced Industry Guide 7, US listed companies can now declare asset values on mineral resources. This now enables capital raises on the market to explore and develop new mines. Tax incentives can be implemented to spur the market, much like the flow-through tax incentive, which has been so successful over Canada.
Well, anything that can stimulate investment in mineral exploration and development is very much needed.
Looks like one last comment here from Xavier. The opportunity is that NEPA represents a bureaucracy and parasitic industry that may be put into the crosshairs of the new administration. Well, with that, many thanks to Debra and Sarah for their excellent presentation, and thank you so much to everyone for attending the webinar. We are working to confirm our webinar for December or January. You will get a notice of our upcoming webinars as details are finalized. The webinars are generally scheduled for the third Friday of each month. All of our webinars are uploaded to YouTube and can be accessed through the mmsa.net website. The video of this webinar will be on the website within a week. The MMSA webinars are supported by the MMSA Jacqueline Foundation. We will send you a notice when the video and slides are posted on the website. The webinar is now ended. Thank you very much.